When I found the first pile of broken concrete behind my back fence, I honestly thought somebody had made a stupid mistake. Stuff like that happens out in the county every once in a while. A driver gets lost, dumps in the wrong place, realizes it later, and comes back to clean it up. At least that's what I told myself while I stood there on a cool Saturday morning staring at chunks of cracked sidewalk, twisted rebar, soaked insulation, and busted plywood scattered across the edge of my property. I remember shaking my head, taking a couple pictures with my phone just in case, then going back to fixing the fence I'd been working on, because I figured the problem would disappear as quietly as it showed up. It didn't. 7 days later, I walked out with a cup of coffee in my hand, looked toward that same corner, and nearly dropped the mug. The pile hadn't disappeared. It had tripled. There were roofing shingles now, broken pipes, drywall dust blowing across the grass. Even a portable toilet somebody had apparently decided wasn't worth hauling away. That's when my gut stopped telling me it was an accident and started whispering that somebody believed my land belonged to them. My name is Nathan Cole. I live outside the small town of Ashbrook, about 40 minutes from the nearest city. My property sits right behind a newer subdivision with one of those homeowners associations that seems to think every blade of grass within 5 miles exists for their convenience. I've never been part of their HOA. My land was here decades before their houses were built, and I preferred it that way. I liked the quiet. I liked watching deer wander across the backfield every evening. Most weekends I stayed busy repairing equipment, cutting firewood, or helping my elderly neighbor Earl with whatever project he had started and regretted halfway through. We waved at people in the subdivision whenever we crossed paths, but that was about the extent of our relationship. They lived their lives. I lived mine. At least until somebody decided my property was cheaper than paying landfill fees. That afternoon, I pulled the memory card from my security cameras, expecting maybe one pickup truck sneaking through after dark. Instead, I watched 3 large construction trucks drive through a narrow opening beside my old fence in broad daylight like they owned the place. Every driver wore reflective safety gear. Every truck carried the logo of the contractor renovating the HOA clubhouse. They backed into my property, raised the dump beds, unloaded tons of debris, then casually drove away without even looking around. Nobody hurried. Nobody acted nervous. That was somehow the part that irritated me the most. They weren't hiding because they genuinely believed nobody would ever challenge them. So instead of storming into the subdivision screaming at people, I did something my father taught me years ago. When somebody else is making mistakes, don't interrupt them. Let them finish. I spent the next several days documenting everything. Every new load got photographed. Every timestamp was matched with camera footage. I measured distances from my survey markers. I printed county regulations covering illegal dumping on private property. The more I read, the more interesting things became. Around here, illegal dumping isn't treated like littering. Each incident can trigger separate penalties, environmental cleanup costs, and civil liability. Suddenly, that growing pile wasn't just garbage. It was evidence. Then something else caught my attention. While comparing my property survey with county GIS records, I noticed a gravel road running along my northern boundary. Construction crews, landscaping trucks, maintenance vehicles, delivery vans, everybody servicing the subdivision used that road every single day. I had never really questioned it because it had existed long before the houses showed up, but curiosity made me dig deeper. I searched recorded plats, easement filings, old deeds, utility maps. Hours turned into almost an entire weekend before I finally leaned back in my chair staring at my computer screen with a grin I couldn't quite hide. There wasn't a recorded road easement anywhere. None. The road everybody treated like public access wasn't public at all. It crossed my property. People had simply used it for so many years that everyone assumed somebody else had secured the legal paperwork. Nobody ever had. Monday morning, I ordered fresh private property signs, bright enough that nobody could claim they missed them. I also contacted a local attorney named Rebecca Lawson, not because I planned to sue immediately, but because I wanted every move to stay inside the law. She reviewed everything over coffee in her office, watched several camera clips, then looked up at me with the kind of smile attorneys get when somebody else's bad decisions have already done 90% of their work. "Nathan," she said, "if your survey is accurate, they're standing on very thin ice. Don't lose your temper. Give them one opportunity to fix it." That sounded fair. So I mailed a certified letter to the HOA board explaining exactly what I had documented. I requested 4 simple things. Remove every piece of construction debris from my property. Restore the damaged ground. Acknowledge in writing that the dumping occurred. Meet with me to discuss future access across the road if they intended to keep using it. I honestly believed someone would read that letter, realize the exposure they were facing, and solve everything quietly. 3 days later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a 2-page response signed by HOA President Denise Holloway. According to her, the debris was merely incidental construction overflow. There was no evidence the association had authorized dumping, and any inconvenience I experienced was unfortunate but not their responsibility. She even suggested I should appreciate the future increase in neighborhood property values once the renovation project was complete. I read that sentence 3 times before laughing out loud. They hadn't just refused to clean up the mess. They had challenged me to prove them wrong. I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, looked out my kitchen window toward that gravel road, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I knew exactly what my next move was. I never answered Denise's letter. There wasn't anything left to say, and honestly, I think silence unsettles arrogant people far more than arguments ever do. Instead, I drove down to the county offices Tuesday morning carrying a binder nearly 3 inches thick. Every photograph was labeled. Every security video had matching timestamps. Every survey map was highlighted. The environmental compliance officer spent almost 45 minutes going through everything before looking up and saying, "Well, they certainly made this easy for us." I asked what happened next. He smiled and said, "Now we make a few phone calls." By Thursday afternoon, inspectors were standing on my property measuring debris piles, while representatives from the contractor suddenly acted like they had never seen the place before. One superintendent actually had the nerve to ask if we could work something out neighbor to neighbor. I reminded him that neighbors usually ask permission before using someone else's land as a landfill. He didn't have much to say after that. The county issued notices almost immediately, and while I wasn't told the exact amount of the penalties, I knew they weren't small because 2 different board members suddenly began leaving voicemail messages asking if we could have a friendly conversation. Funny how people discover friendship after government paperwork starts arriving, but I still wasn't interested in talking. Not yet. The next step had already been planned with Rebecca. She kept reminding me that emotions lose cases while documentation wins them. "Everything you do from this point forward," she said, "should make a judge smile." Those words stayed in my head Friday morning when a local contractor backed a flatbed trailer onto my property carrying a heavy steel gate, 2 reinforced posts, and enough concrete to anchor both into the ground. Earl wandered over from his place carrying his usual coffee thermos and watched the crew unload everything. "You finally gonna do it?" he asked with that little grin old farmers get whenever they know exactly what's about to happen. "Yep," I answered. "Wish I'd done it years ago." By sunset, the gate stood across the gravel road with clean welded hinges, a coated lock, reflective markers, and 2 bright signs that read, "Private property, no unauthorized access." There wasn't anything aggressive about it. It wasn't electrified. It wasn't hidden. It simply marked exactly where my property began and where permission was now required. Legally speaking, it was probably the least dramatic thing I could have done. Practically speaking, it was like shutting off oxygen. Monday morning was absolute chaos. Around 7:30, I heard engines revving before I even finished breakfast. 3 dump trucks sat lined up outside the gate. Behind them were 2 excavators on trailers, several landscaping crews, concrete deliveries, plumbing subcontractors, and eventually, a line of irritated workers stretching nearly a quarter-mile down the road. Some drivers climbed out expecting to move the gate themselves until they noticed the survey stakes, the recorded property markers, and the fresh legal notices Rebecca had attached inside waterproof sleeves. One foreman knocked on my front door. "Morning," he said politely. "Can you open the gate? We're already behind schedule." "Do you have written permission to cross my property?" I asked. He hesitated. "We've always used this road." "That's not what I asked," he sighed. "No, and unfortunately I can't help you." He rubbed both hands across his face, thanked me for staying calm, then walked back toward the line of trucks while making what looked like a very uncomfortable phone call. By lunchtime, the renovation project had effectively frozen. Equipment trapped inside couldn't leave. Equipment scheduled to arrive couldn't enter. Dumpsters filled with demolition waste had nowhere to go. Concrete deliveries expired. Workers who were paid by the hour stood around drinking coffee because there wasn't anything they could actually do. Every hour that passed cost somebody money, and unlike the debris they'd dumped on my property, these invoices couldn't simply be buried and forgotten. Tuesday brought the lawyers. Denise arrived first, wearing designer sunglasses and enough confidence to fill the entire road. Beside her walked an attorney carrying a leather briefcase who looked irritated before anyone had even spoken. Denise stopped a few feet from the gate and crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous, Mr. Cole." "Morning, Denise. You're interfering with a community improvement project." "Actually," I replied, "I'm standing on my own property." Her attorney stepped forward. "Perhaps we can reach a temporary understanding while ownership questions are resolved." I couldn't help smiling. "Ownership questions? I thought your letter said none of this was your responsibility." Denise's expression tightened immediately. Rebecca had warned me this moment would come. Once people realize bluffing failed, they often pretend confusion instead. "Let's stop playing games," Denise snapped. "Open the gate." "No, you can't hold an entire neighborhood hostage." "I didn't. You built your project around land you never had permission to use." She pointed toward the stalled trucks. "These people are losing money because of you." I looked directly at her. "They're losing money because someone decided saving landfill fees mattered more than respecting private property." For several seconds, nobody said anything. Even the construction workers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Then Denise laughed in that dismissive way people laugh when they don't have an actual argument. "You'll lose in court." Rebecca, who had quietly driven up a few minutes earlier, finally joined the conversation. "If you're filing today," she said pleasantly, "please make sure your complaint also explains the unauthorized dumping, environmental citations, lack of recorded easement, and the association's written denial. It'll save everyone time during discovery." I have rarely seen confidence disappear so quickly from someone's face. Denise looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at Rebecca. Then he quietly asked if we could continue the discussion somewhere private. We ended up sitting around a folding table inside my workshop. No raised voices. No dramatic threats. Just paperwork spread across the table. Rebecca laid out every survey, every county citation, every camera still, every recorded deed. When Denise claimed contractors must have acted independently, Rebecca slid her own letter back across the table, reminding everyone that the HOA had officially denied responsibility only 4 days earlier instead of investigating. That decision boxed them into a corner they couldn't escape. The contractor's insurance representative eventually joined by speakerphone. He sounded exhausted before introductions were even finished. "Can someone please tell me," he asked, "why my client is suddenly involved in an illegal dumping investigation and a property access dispute?" Silence filled the room. Finally, I answered, "Because your trucks crossed private property without permission and your customer insisted nothing happened after receiving evidence." Another long silence followed before the insurance representative quietly muttered, "That's less than ideal." Over the next week, the pressure became impossible for the HOA board to ignore. Residents started asking why the clubhouse renovation had stopped. Contractors demanded payment for idle equipment. Cleanup companies refused additional work until access issues were resolved. Even homeowners who normally supported the board began questioning why nobody had verified legal access before approving a multi-million-dollar renovation. I received angry emails accusing me of hurting property values, but I also received handwritten notes from 2 residents apologizing for how the board had treated me. One elderly couple even dropped off a homemade apple pie with a note that read, "We don't agree with what happened. Thank you for standing your ground the right way." That note meant more to me than they probably realized because it reminded me this fight was never with an entire neighborhood. It was with a handful of people who had confused authority with ownership. By the beginning of the 3rd week, Denise requested one final meeting. This time there were no sunglasses, no speeches, and no demands. Just a tired woman carrying a legal pad who looked like someone finally forced to deal with consequences instead of excuses. She sat across from me, took a slow breath, and asked the first honest question I'd heard since this whole mess began. "Nathan, what exactly will it take for you to unlock that gate?" Her voice sounded completely different now, and for the first time, the negotiation wasn't happening on her terms anymore. I looked at Denise for a few seconds before answering because, truthfully, I wasn't interested in humiliating her anymore. I'd already proven the point that mattered. The gate had done its job. The county investigation was moving forward. The entire board had finally been forced to accept that private property wasn't just a suggestion written on paper. "My terms haven't changed," I said calmly. "Every piece of debris comes off my land. The county fines get paid without argument. The association signs a written acknowledgement accepting responsibility. And if you want to keep using this road, we negotiate a real easement with annual compensation, maintenance requirements, insurance coverage, and the right for me to revoke access if this agreement is ever violated again. Denise slowly nodded while writing each point down. There was no eye-rolling this time, no sarcastic comments. Just a woman realizing that pride had become far more expensive than honesty. A week later, the cleanup crews arrived, only this time they came through the front entrance after requesting temporary permission in writing. I watched excavators carefully remove every broken slab of concrete, every twisted piece of steel, every handful of contaminated soil. They even reseeded the damaged grass and replaced sections of my fence that their trucks had bent during the dumping. Earl leaned against my truck, watching the whole operation with a grin. Amazing what people can accomplish when lawyers start charging by the hour, he joked. I laughed because he wasn't wrong. The transformation was almost unbelievable. Within 3 days, my property looked better than it had before the entire mess started. Then came the paperwork. Rebecca and I met with the HOA's legal team in a conference room downtown. The final easement agreement was almost 30 pages long. It established a legal right for limited access across that gravel road, but only under very specific conditions. The association would pay an annual access fee that adjusted with inflation. They would maintain the road at their own expense. They would carry additional liability insurance, naming me as an insured party. Any commercial construction project would require advance written notice. Most importantly, any future unauthorized dumping, trespassing, or violation of the agreement would immediately suspend access until the issue was resolved. No gray areas, no assumptions. Everything in writing. Denise signed first. I signed second. When the last page was notarized, Rebecca quietly leaned over and whispered, "This is what accountability looks like." She was right. The money honestly wasn't even the best part. Sure, the annual payments were nice, but that had never been my goal. What mattered was knowing nobody would ever again treat my property like free real estate simply because they thought I wouldn't push back. A few days after the agreement became official, I unlocked the gate just before sunrise. The first contractor stopped beside my truck instead of driving straight through. He rolled down his window and smiled. "Morning, Mr. Cole. Appreciate the access." "Morning," I replied. "Drive safe." It was such a small interaction, but somehow it meant everything. Respect had replaced entitlement. Permission had replaced assumption. That's all I'd wanted from the beginning. Even some of the homeowners who had blamed me during the dispute eventually came around. Several admitted they had never known the road wasn't legally protected. Others confessed the board had kept residents almost completely in the dark while the project spiraled out of control. A few months later, new board members were elected, and one of the first things they did was introduce stricter oversight for contractor management and legal compliance. Ironically, the entire neighborhood became better governed because someone had decided to dump garbage on the wrong piece of land. Every now and then, people ask me if I regret making such a big deal out of what started as a few truckloads of construction debris. My answer is always the same. If I had ignored those first piles, they wouldn't have stopped at one corner of my property. People who face no consequences rarely become more respectful. They simply become more comfortable crossing the next line. The gate is still standing today. Every morning I unlock it as a courtesy, not because I'm required to. And every evening when I lock it again, I'm reminded that ownership isn't just about having your name on a deed. It's about having the courage to protect what's yours, even when everyone around you insists you're the unreasonable one. Sometimes the strongest response isn't yelling louder than the other side. Sometimes it's quietly enforcing the rules they assumed would never apply to them. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. Did I go too far by shutting down the only road they depended on? Or was it the only language the HOA was ever going to understand? Let me know down in the comments, because these situations are never as black and white as people think. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, difficult neighbors, or someone who believed your property existed for their convenience, share your story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because I've learned one thing over the years. The most unbelievable neighborhood stories usually turn out to be completely true.